So again, thank you for coming to KU. Let me introduce Professor Olha Tytarenko to all of you. She's assistant professor of practice at the Modern Languages and Literatures Department at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. She received her PhD in Slavic Languages and Literatures at the University of Toronto in 2016, received her BA and MA in English from Ivan Franko National University in Lviv, Ukraine, and an MA in Russian and Comparative Literature from the Pennsylvania State University. Her primary research interests are 19th century Russian literature, cultural history, political mythology, and Russian religious thought. Her dissertation, titled Rethinking Historical Mysticism in the Age of Russian Realism, examines the ways Russian prominent writers Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, and Saltykov-Shchedrin approach folk mysticism as an expression of historical thinking and the political views of the Russian people. Her current research focuses on the role of mythology and mythologizing in politics, both of the past epochs and in contemporary Russian society, specifically on the way several core cultural myths were and continue to be exploited by figures in power to secure and maintain the status quo. Olha writes poetry and short prose in Ukrainian, and also she's a co-translator and editor on various literary projects from Ukrainian and Russian into English. Welcome.
Well, thank you. Thank you for inviting me here. I'm glad to be here. And so my lecture will be based on the research that I did for my dissertation, and also want to show like the trajectory of where it's going now, what I'm currently working on, a few words. So I'm going to talk about a few events, and here's the kind of timeline of the events, the key events that I'm going to refer to in my talk. And so the 2 decades of 1850s and 1860s that frame my research were of particular significance in the life of the Russian Empire. And the era of, and the key events were, for me, for my research, the Crimean War, the emancipation of the serfs in 1861, and the celebration of the millennium of the Russian Empire. And I'll discuss briefly the popular disturbances, and I'll go back to the slides for you as a reference. During this decade, this decade was extremely important in the life of the empire. And Russia entered a new phase with Alexander II, the first Russian autocrat who abolished serfdom. And the emancipation of 1861 was supposed to become a climactic point in the Russian history, a symbolic end of the old regime of serfdom and the beginning of a new era. And this visual shows you this is the Lubok that was produced in the late 1880s, and it shows the moment of emancipation. The moment when you can see the Tsar Alexander II, who is reading the manifesto of emancipation to the people. And the people surround him, and you can see that people are kneeling in reverence and respect and adoration. And so this represents well what Pogodin's ideal of the golden age was, where there was one flock and one shepherd. And Pogodin referred to it referred to the relationship between the Tsar and the people as this golden age. So the millennium of Russia, following shortly the emancipation in 1862, presented a perfect opportunity to celebrate the achievements of the emancipation, to solidify the idea of a new stage of historical development, and to convey the sense of progress in the place of the sense of countries' backwardness that was felt after the defeat of the Crimean War. Of course, this narrative of emancipation was created after the event, and the celebratory rhetoric was constructed in the press and reflected more the anticipation of the educated class. And the actual proclamation of the emancipation never happened as it is depicted in this print. The Tsar never read the manifesto to the people. He didn't want to be anywhere close to the people at that time. But this is a fascinating example of how, and it like only less than 22 decades passed, and this is an example how a historical memory gets revised and rewritten. So the pathos of the new era conflicted with the facts on the ground. And in reality, the socio-political situation was very unstable and unsettling. So Alexander felt forced to carry out the abolition of serfdom in fear that if it was not done from above, it would be achieved from below through the revolution. And the concern was grounded in the fact of recurring mass popular disturbances during the Crimean War. The first wave of the unrest, let me go back to the slide. So the first wave of the unrest hit the empire in 1854 and 55, and the second in 1858 and 60. And Alexander, and during those 2 years, 58 and 60, over 330 disturbances occurred in the countryside. That was a very high number in the 18th century. So Alexander realized very well that the conditions of emancipation did not meet the expectations of the people. And he anticipated mass peasant protest in the countryside in response to the emancipation. And indeed, in 1861, there was another wave of peasant protest, and now, if we compare, like we had 330 cases in 58-60. In 1861, there were 1,300 cases of peasant disturbances. And all those cases were thoroughly documented by officials installed in the provinces. And some reports and memoirs of the most important disturbances were published in the press. So the image of the narod, of the people, Russian people, that agitated Alexander so much on the eve of the reforms, and that crystallized particularly through the post-emancipation disturbances, was distinctly different from the image of the narod depicted in the literature of 1850s and 60s. And the rebellious peasants were nothing like the peasants that Turgenev described in his famous The Hunter's Sketchers, and the collection of short stories that offers an idealized image of Russian peasantry. And the actual peasants were also not the folks described by the groups of ethnographers who went into the countryside in 1850s with the ethnographic expeditions to collect and describe the folklore and the life of people. And so what earlier had been generally perceived as a political commune now appeared to be politically conscious social group capable of protesting socio-political conditions that it found unjust. So major cases of disturbances also revealed that the language of the narod, expressing its political thinking and expectations, was obscure and profusely mythical. And the pre-emancipation Russian literature did not offer a key to understanding of this language. Subsequently, in the 60s, as I argue in my dissertation, there emerged a new debate on the narod, on the people, that brought together some writers, journalists, thinkers, historians, who aimed to understand the people and their historical thinking through, and their historical attitudes through certain myths that incited their behavior as the collective. So the category that I use in my research is historical mysticism. And I borrow the concept from Daniil Mordovtsev, a Russian and historian writer, and Russian and Ukrainian historian and writer. In one of his articles on the nature of causes of popular disturbances in Russia, Mordovtsev suggested that the narod had its own version of Russian history and tended to apply a certain mythological framework to make sense of certain historical events or transformations. This mysticism often incited and informed the narod's engagement in the political life of the empire. I engage with this concept further to suggest that the historical mysticism of the narod comprised its complex eschatological vision that absorbed various myths and beliefs and synthesized religious, sectarian, and folkloric ideas. This political mythology embraces apocalyptic attitudes with a strong conception of good and evil, Christ and Antichrist dichotomy, and the anticipation and the vision of last days and the new kingdom, the mythology of the Tsar and the Tsar Redeemer, and also the mythology of the false Tsar or a false Tsar pretender. I do not see those myths as separate myths. To the contrary, I argue that they comprise a coherent system where all elements are closely interconnected. Given the time limitations, I want to focus only on one myth that I think is central in this historical mysticism of the people. This is the myth of the Tsar. This is very interesting also because the educated society responded to, during the 60s, they tried to understand the relationship between the Tsar and the people. And so they tried to understand the monarchistic attitudes of the people and the implications of popular beliefs for the future development of Russia. And a brief note on my methodology. So I derive my conclusions from the analysis of rumors and myths that circulated among the narod during the popular disturbances, and that were documented in the reports on these disturbances, memoirs, articles on the nature and causes of peasant unrest published throughout 1860s. And there were a lot of articles and pieces published on historiography in 1860s, because with the Alexander II there was more freedom of expression in the press that was never allowed under Nikolai's rule. So I also studied the research by historians and scholars, and especially those historians who were interested in Old Believers mythology. And I use my findings from all the sources in my analysis of three main literary works that I focus on in my dissertation, which are Lev Tolstoy, War and Peace, Dostoevsky, The Possessed, and Mikhail Saltykov-Shchedrin, The History of a Town. And Saltykov-Shchedrin is my favorite. I think he's genius and his work is fascinating. So I'll focus on this work a little bit, and I'll talk about how he approaches the popular mysticism in this work and the conclusions that he derives from it. But before I do it, I want to talk a little bit about the concept of popular monarchism and why it became a topic for that generated discussion among the educated society. So as I mentioned, I believe that the popular conception of monarchy, or the myth of the Tsar, or also referred to in scholarship as folk Tsarism or messianic Tsarism, is in the center of Narod's historical mysticism. And all major popular uprisings were carried out in the name of the Tsar. And although not necessarily in the name of the acting Tsar, as the history of Russia, specifically the 18th century uprising under Pugachev suggests. And Pugachev was a pretender to the Russian throne who claimed to be Peter III, the supposedly assassinated husband of Catherine the Great. And his uprising was huge in the 18th century, was traumatic experience for the Russian history, and that destabilized the regime of Catherine the Great. And the memories of Pugachev's uprising were revived in the years of 1850s and 60s with all those disturbances. So with mass popular disturbances, every reigning Tsar would feel threatened. And that's how Alexander II felt before and after the emancipation, despite the fact that the reports on the post-emancipation uprisings suggested that the peasants shared a common mistrust not to the Tsar, but to the landlords and governmental officials and the priests, who they considered as the agents of the Antichrist. And these agents were put in a very unfortunate position to explain the terms of emancipation to the people. And the document of the manifesto, the document was written in very confusing language, purposefully just to confuse people and that produce a lot of and questions and confusion. So the terms were extremely confusing. But the fact, contrary to the expectations, the peasants did not get what they expected to get from the emancipation. They didn't get the land and they didn't get the immediate freedom. So the peasants believed that the evil agents of the Tsar concealed the true emancipation from the people and spread the false manifesto. So hence the rhetoric of the post-emancipation uprisings was reclamation of the true freedom in the name of the Tsar, so in the name of Alexander II. But the image of the true Tsar in popular imagination is very complex, and the ideal Tsar may not always correspond to the acting Tsar, which all those which the appearance of many pretenders to the Russian throne shows. So nevertheless, Alexander found rebellious peasants very unpredictable and menacing. And additionally, the fear of the inevitable mass rebellion in the manner of Pugachev's uprising agitated the minds of the ruling elite. So he intended to use the occasion of the millennial celebration of Russia to solidify the bond between the Tsar and the Russian people that he perceived as weakened, to suppress the recent memories of the unrest, and to remind the people of their humble nature and of their devotion to the authorities and acceptance of the autocracy as the expression of their own will. And to do that, he reenacted the legend of the founding of Rus, according to which the three Varangian princes were summoned, were invited to rule over the people of Rus. And the whole event was very performative, and Alexander II came to Novgorod by sailing along the river Volkhov to reenact the symbolic arrival of Ruriks. So in this slide shows the image of the invitation of the Varangian princes. So many public discussions of the millennial celebration emphasize the exclusive nature of the relationship between the Tsar and the Russian people. These, I believe, triggered an interest in re-examining the conception of popular monarchism in 1860s. And my main writers were all engaged with this notion. Through rethinking it in their literary works or journalistic pieces, they thought to understand the structure of power within the narod's historical vision, the place of the narod in it, and the implications of this for the development of Russia. At the same time, working through the political mythology helped them better formulate the position of their own social group within these dynamics, or express in an indirect way their concerns and social anxieties. So I will try to talk briefly about Saltykov's work and what he's doing in the history of a town, written in late 1860s. So in many ways, this work responds to the events that I have been talking about. And Saltykov is reflecting on the history of popular disturbances in Russia that showed the social discontent of the people, but never led to change of the regime. And he hoped to see the collapse of the autocracy and believed it would be achieved through the peasants' revolution. He expected this revolution in the decades after the emancipation. This did not happen, and as a journalist and a social critic, he was preoccupied with the nature of the people's devotion to autocracy. He locates the reason for this in popular beliefs and makes them an object of close critical investigation in his work. Here, his main preoccupation is with the effect of the persistence of mystical beliefs of the narod and its on its historical development and on that of Russia in general. So in a manner of a quasi-biblical story, the history tells the fictional tale of the town of Glupov, literally, which means a stupid town, a non-existent periphery that is supposed to symbolically embody all Russia, from its creation until its apocalyptic demise. And the work features the life of Glupov and its inhabitants under 22 governors. And this is the version of the history from the perspective of the people, in which historical events are translated into the language that fuses mythical and mystical beliefs. Saltykov shows how every large-scale catastrophe or crisis is translated into the language of symbols and signs, and how the synthesized meaning redefines the people's relationship with the governors. This relationship is representative of the relationships of the Tsar and the narod, where in accordance with the Tsar myth, the analogy of the governor with the paternal authority and God is preserved. The theme of salvation is defining in this relationship and is a building block of the myth. In the eyes of the narod, the salvation of Russia depended on the personal piety of the monarch. This in turn ensured the salvation of an individual and the commune. Impious czars, such as Peter the Great, for example, presented a quandary to these dynamics, and the popular mind had to come to terms with the conflict that's created within the overarching scheme of deliverance. Such czars were demonized in the traditional popular imagination, and the narod's distrust to the monarchs was nevertheless inseparable from its need to have a legitimate and righteous czar. And Saltykov transfers these dynamics into the history of the town. Every crisis that befalls Glupov triggers distrust of the governor as God's appointee, and a psychological mechanism is set into motion that removes him from the sacred role of a savior and projects him as a demonic figure. This projection becomes a recurring pattern in the life of the Glupovites. Saltykov is interested in how and why it happens, but all the more he seeks to understand the reasons why after every dethroned governor, the people are ready to either restore the governor's initial sacred image or accept the next one as a father figure, as Batyushka. And time and again, Saltykov shows lack of resistance on people's part, even in the cases when the governor is not vindicated. The Glupovites fall under one critique that Saltykov terms the energy of inaction, energia бездействия. The word energy that presupposes a capacity for a certain activity, when collocated with the word бездействие, is in intentionally oxymoronic fashion masterfully renders the satirist critic of the submissiveness of the Russian people, who are nevertheless viewed as being potentially capable of action. Saltykov insists that two capacities coexist in Glupovites and define them as the collective. Since every impetus to act is suppressed by the energy of inaction, the commune continuously relapses in some kind of existential loop. One reason that can explain the persistence of the energy of inaction is the fact that the Glupovites consider themselves not the object, not the subject, but the object of history, and therefore assume a passive role in it. In this frame of mind, every evil is accepted as a part of predetermined plan, hence a historical necessity. A different form of resistance and a shift in recurring restoration pattern occurs with the governor Ugryum Burcheyev. And his name kind of suggests gloomy grumbler in English. So under the rule of Ugryum Burcheyev, the Tsar myth is subverted. And the circumstances under which this happens may shed light on Saltykov's own historical thought and his expectations that he projected onto the people. So Burcheyev is known for his two exploits, the demolition of the town of Glupov and the attempted destruction of the river. On one day, with an axe in his hands, the governor launches the demolition of the town of Glupov. Without questioning his authorities, the Glupovites partake in this act, and they help Burcheyev destroy their own hometown. And here Saltykov tries to understand the reasons for the people's obedience under circumstances that are supposed to provoke insubordination. And time and again he finds the cause in the people's fatalistic, eschatologically inclined mind. The demolition is accepted as an actual end of historical time, a long predetermined tragedy that overshadows any individual interest or aspirations, rendering them superfluous. And the moment of Glupovites' awakening after Burcheyev unsuccessfully attempts to destroy the river, which, unlike the Glupovites, resists the tyranny. This time, the Glupovites see the Burcheyev's deed as a sacrilegious act. The governor's infringement of the design of God's order can be read as his violation of the sanctity that cements the relationship between the people and the monarch. And the Glupovites' altered understanding of Burcheyev's point to a subversion of their system of beliefs that had been formed and preserved for generations. Saltykov accentuates the importance of seeing with their own eyes as opposed to accepting imagined reality. And the iconic image of Burcheyev, quote, the governor hovering in the sky above the town and securing the sleep of the inhabitants, end quote, is replaced with the Glupovites seeing the idiot, Burcheyev, sleeping and snoring heavily on the ground. And this points to a complete change of perception, with that was initially seen from below is now seen from above. And with the change of an angle, the initial image is realized as constructed. So Saltykov masterfully plays with the sleep imagery in his work to suggest that the power structure is undermined. And he briefly suggests that the development of independent thought among the Glupovites. After that, the narrative comes to a halt, most likely for the censorship reasons, but there are implications that the revolutionary activity was happening during that time. And then it recommences with the description of the apocalypse with which the history of a town ends. So the chronicler tells that after a week, and it's not clear what was happening during this week, so the Glupovites were struck by a grand spectacle. The north grew dark. Something terrifying was coming from there. Full of rage, it was approaching, rumbling, buzzing, and groaning. There was a complete state of chaos, and when it was approaching, the time was stopping its flow. The earth was shaking, the sun grew dim. The Glupovites fell down terrified. They said, "It has come." So Burcheyev suddenly disappeared, and that was the end of the governor. He just disappeared. And the history stopped, and this is the end of the book. So in the last passage, Saltykov encrypted his political message. There are different interpretations of what the sin means in the scholarship, and some Soviet commentators read it either as approaching rule of Nicholas I, other linked it to the revolutionary activity, to the anticipated revolution by the people. And some considered it to be retribution of history and that punishes the Glupovites who never rose against autocracy. In the post-Soviet scholarship, the emphasis has shifted to the eschatological aspect of the final scene. Mikhail Nazarenko believes the history of Glupov ends because it exhausted itself, implying that there is no hope after the history ends. And he excludes any possibility of the Glupovites' regeneration. So my reading of the scene concurs with the scholars who invest it with positively emancipating content. However, in addition to asking the question, what does it mean, I'm interested in how and why the symbolic it becomes possible and necessary for the Glupovites, and what makes the apocalypse the only possible ending for the history of Saltykov's imagined commune. Saltykov thought about the people and their historical development is complex and evolved over time. And in the early 1860s, for example, he believed that the true emancipation of the people was supposed to be a joint effort between democratic intelligentsia and the peasantry. So before and especially after the emancipation, radical youth put much hope on massive popular resistance as a means to overthrow the regime. However, for 9 years after the emancipation, no rebirth occurred, despite the radicals' continuous propaganda in the village. Saltykov's answer, which appears repeatedly in his journalistic pieces, is enlightenment of the people as the only way to supersede the old mythological paradigms. The lack of education, according to him, is compensated with the mythical ideas and beliefs. The mythological frame of mind is grounded in the idea of predetermination. In the popular mind, the tyranny, произвол, of the ruler is accepted as a part of a scheme of repentance within a larger predetermined design. So by adhering to fatalism, people deny themselves an active role in history. Mysticism and fatalism are, in Saltykov's thinking, medieval and not suitable for the civil society. However, in Saltykov's critique, sustaining the narod's mystical beliefs was beneficial for the ruling elite. And he made this point in his journalistic pieces and in his book as well, because he thought that these beliefs guaranteed the stability of the autocratic regime. Saltykov's solution is the enlightenment of the people, but not from the above, but from within. And he criticizes the enlightenment from above precisely for that reasons, because this enlightenment is really censored by the ruling elite, because they want to keep those myths alive. So once the Glupovites start thinking independently, this eventually may shake their entire belief system. So for Saltykov, destroying the last myth is absolutely necessary, and it would involve traumatic experience. The word that frequently appears in his journalism is потрясение, which means shock, commotion, perturbation. And it is charged with positive apocalyptic content, as it suggests a new beginning after complete obliteration. In my reading, the history ends precisely with that потрясение, which is also the word, a neuter word in Russian, which would explain the use of the pronoun оно. So, and he suggests that the end of through that потрясение, he suggests that that would be the end of the era of the Glupovites, because educated, enlightened people could no longer be defined as the stupid people, glupovites. So, and the end does not imply the physical death of the people, rather a transformative experience that leads to a redefinition of their self-image. So in my reading of Saltykov's conclusion, once the mysticism is demystified, the social political transformations are unavoidable. And I think this is what happens in 1905. During the Bloody Sunday, when the narod brought a petition to the Tsar Nicholas II, and in the petition they just expressed their discontent about the working conditions at the factory, and that was not revolutionary in nature at all. There was a crowd of peaceful peasants bringing the petition to the Tsar because this was something that was common in Russia. So the soldiers of the Imperial Guard started firing in the unarmed demonstrators. This event led to the breach of trust between the people and the monarch. So this was the moment of demystification in the language of the history of the town, and to subsequent collapse of the autocracy in 1917. And just like Burchaev, who disappeared in the apocalypse that concluded the work, that was the end of the Tsarism in Russia. Saltykov would want this to happen during his own time. But it never did. I haven't come across a discussion of the events of 1917 in connection to Saltykov's ideas and his historical thought, expressed in the history of a town. However, Dostoevsky, the Possessed, is often read as a prophetic vision of these events. Interestingly, Dostoevsky denied any possibility of the narod rising against their Tsar. And in one way or another, all three authors that I'm working, I focused on in my dissertation, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, and Saltykov, in their works were responding to the events that I described, that I discussed briefly, of 1850s and 1860s. And I have argued that the understanding of the narod's historical thinking expressed through various myths became for these writers a prerequisite for shaping the image of the national and ideological nucleus of the Russian Empire in 1860s. I believe that the study of popular political mythology and various ways it was understood, utilized, or adopted by literary authors in their works shed light on the life of the empire in the time of crisis, on the concomitant social anxiety across class divide, as well as on the intellectual attempt of some prominent thinkers at redefining Russian national identity in the post-reform era. And again, Saltykov believed that sustaining and encouraging popular mythology, especially that about the Tsar and his sacred role in historical destiny of Russia, was beneficial for the regime. And the education of the people that would potentially replace mystical ideas with a rational thought was not in the interest of the ruling elite. So in the 19th century, in order to secure and maintain the status quo, the ruling elite exploited these myths and beliefs when dealing with the internal or external crisis. In my current research that I'm working on, I'm trying to show how similar mythology that was utilized in the 19th century is being exploited in Russia today. But now I focus on the international affairs to study the mechanism behind national project of state building in the 1860s and that of the 21st century. So practically, I want to apply my conclusions from the study of the 19th century politics to the analysis of contemporary politics. And the international conflicts that I'm working on, I'm focusing on Georgian Ossetian conflict of 2008, the current Russian-Ukrainian war, and the Russia's intervention in the current Syrian conflict. And I want to show that by manipulating public opinion through the utilization of political mythology, the Russian state transforms violence in dealing with events that destabilize the regime into a strategy that consolidates it. Thank you for your attention.